Let's take a look at politics and society during the last part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. Remember, a Gilded Age means basically from after the Civil War until around 1900, but the Industrial Age went on a little bit beyond that. So generally around the turn of the century. And in this notes video, we're going to look at some of the aspects of American society and life that are just interesting and that shaped America. Like as you look at this screen, during this time period is when America would get the Statue of Liberty as a gift from France. And there are all kinds of issues in this country with food and how we handled Native Americans who were not willing to give up their land. And so those are going to lead to a lot of conflicts and wars out west. Just daily life. Would we continue to use gold or would we use silver? All of these things are happening in America around the turn of the century. So in 1876, as a celebration to America or for America, on our birthday, being 100 years old, France gives the United States the Statue of Liberty to put in New York Harbor, and it becomes really an iconic symbol of the nation, but it happened during this Gilded Age. Remember, gilded means that it glimmers like gold, but if you dig a little bit deeper, it's really not. So there was a lot of things that were great about America at the time. One of those would be immigration. This nation is a nation of immigrants who've come to America. Many have come through New York City and the famous location of Ellis Island, literally an island next to the Statue of Liberty. People coming to this country would go be processed and then go on to life in New York and wherever. And so these two, Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, become a symbol for America and of America for immigrants coming in around the turn of the century. And they will cause America to change, right? We have so many people coming. And generally what happens is when people come to America, most would settle in the city. And as always in American history, once immigrants get here, then they typically don't want anyone else to come. And so then they say, well, we're glad we're here, but no one else, please. And that would cause some issues, especially as these cities begin to grow. And we are going to see really for the first time a swelling of cities. Urbanization is going to be a thing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And cities will be places of great business, but also dangerous living conditions, filth. They don't really have it figured out yet how to do sanitation. And it can become a problem. But also when immigrants come, you have a lot of people from other countries coming together, Ireland, Italy, Poland, Germany, and you can get some tension in these cities. But they definitely are growing, and there are more and more people just moving to the cities, which will cause cities to grow. Doesn't mean that everyone, there's no farmers. There are still farmers. Obviously, people need to eat, but it's a changing America. You can tell by some of these pictures, just some of the conditions that people lived in when they did move to cities, very poor. Most people were really poor in the cities. But there were some who were well off, as you can see by the lower right. And farmers, there were still farmers. It's just now the number of people moving to cities is growing and cities are growing. So we've got cities growing mostly with immigrants from other nations, but there's also African Americans in this country, many of whom would move to the cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit, to escape some of the racist ways of the southern states. It doesn't mean that Chicago, Illinois was perfect by any means, but a lot of the problems there were by custom, not in law, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But from these images you can see there were some who were well-to-do, but most often they were going to be poor in these maybe like on farms, and is working as sharecroppers across the South. So some went to cities, but many stayed in the southern states and were kind of tied to the land, and they were forced to work in the cotton fields or in farming. And life for African Americans after the Civil War, you would think, would have gotten better. And in some ways, obviously, slavery ended, but they still lived a second-class life in the southern states and in many states. In southern states, it was by the law, like the states had passed laws to keep African Americans down, not on the same level as white Americans. In many northern states, It was more by custom. There weren't necessarily laws that were passed, but everyone knew their place. Mostly in the South, if you stepped out of line, you could receive, severe consequences. This could happen in the northern states as well, but southern states are more known for this. Even though the nation had passed the 14th Amendment that said all citizens are equal, every time the federal government made a move, states countered. So think of it as a game of chess. The 14th Amendment was passed that says everyone's going to be treated equally. Well, southern states responded by passing laws that said, okay, we're going to have 2 drinking fountains that are equal, 2 places for people to wait for the bus, for example, as time gets a little long. We have buses and things, but they're equal. And this is validated, right? We know that it's terrible, but it is validated in 1896 with a Supreme Court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. This is generally considered the worst Supreme Court case because it validated and it said it was okay for these southern states to have a system where blacks and whites were separate and that whites had one way of living, blacks another. So as you can see from this drawing, it was based on a case in Louisiana where if you rode a train, you used a nicer train car than if you were of color. And Plessy is pictured here in the bottom left. He was actually a mixed race person, and the people on the train who operated the train didn't want him sitting with white folks. And so that's going to go make its way all the way to the Supreme Court, which is exactly what Plessy was trying to get to happen. Everyone kind of expected the Supreme Court to say no, that you southern states stop doing that, but the Supreme Court was dominated by people who thought that it was fine as long as there's a separate train car or a separate drinking fountain or a separate waiting room, it's fine. They said separate is equal. It does not violate the 14th Amendment. And so this is generally going to be the worst Supreme Court case, or one of the worst. It would be reversed in the 1950s with the Brown versus the Board of Education, which we'll talk later on about in the course. So Plessy versus Ferguson, generally considered just a low point in the Supreme Court, but it validated the separate and equal, but it wasn't really equal. Jim Crow was the system in the South that kept people of color on a lower level. And that's the way it would be until the 1950s. Another aspect of life around the turn of the century, late 1800s is in the 1900s, is just the food. Now, we take for granted the food that we eat has been inspected and it's safe, but that's not the way it was until recently, really. So factories that produce food like meat packing or canned meat or milk, cheese, there were no regulations to protect consumers. You had no idea what you were eating. You didn't know what was in it. If you didn't want the stuff, didn't buy it. No one was forcing you to buy it. But if you bought it, you just had to assume that it was all good. This is all kind of behind the scenes until a book is published called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It was supposed to be more of a book about the labor practices in like meat packing around the Chicago area. Meat packing they put it in cans, right? Because there was no refrigeration yet. So the best way to get meat to people was to salt it and put it in a tin can. We probably wouldn't like it very much today. But so these factories where they process the meat, there was no rules about what would be in the meat, how many, parts of mice or rats or mouse droppings. It was very, very unregulated. It was only during the early 1900s that people started to wonder, like, what can we do to make our food safer and so that we know what we're buying? For example, milk. The milk companies would add plaster of Paris, things that you patch your holes in your wall with, that's white to make the milk whiter. They would put formaldehyde into the food to make it last longer, which we know is bad for your body. It's what you use to preserve things with. So it was just everything was open, no government regulation whatsoever. So today, though, if you buy food, it's been inspected. That's what FDA means, Food and Drug Administration, or the United States Department of Agriculture has looked over your food. So you know when you buy meat, you're only getting hamburger, or when you buy chicken, you know you're only getting chicken, and it's been inspected. This is before all of that. The Jungle, this book, prompts America to start thinking like, man, we need to change this. And so the government is now going to be, for the first time, getting involved. That's really the general theme of the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, is that government is going to grow and become more active. Pure capitalism is going to kind of be pushed aside a little bit, and the government is going to get involved in the production of food and businesses and how long people can work and working conditions. All of that is going to change. So now we think of America as a government being involved. And 1900, not the case at all. But over time, the government will get involved and protect the citizens, especially what they eat and how they work and where they work. Another thing that's interesting is that during the 1860s, this is during the Civil War, that Congress passes the Morel Act, which is interesting because, you know, you probably live near one of these universities. It was started when the federal government gave up some of its land so that states could start universities that focused on agriculture and mechanics. Many of the colleges in the country were more liberal arts, so you could go there and study literature or grammar or history or politics. But where would you go to learn about the science of being a farmer or being a mechanical engineer? There weren't enough of those in the nation. So President Lincoln signed into law the Morel Act, which created the land, that gave the land to states and said states create these universities for agriculture and mechanics. So Ohio State started as an agriculture and mechanics university. Same with all of these. There's about 100 or over 100 of these across the country that started for the purpose of agriculture and mechanics. But now, of course, you can major in anything at these. That's why sometimes you hear Ohio State referred to as a land grant institution, because it came from this law that was passed. The federal government gave away the land. But if you lived during this time, what would you do to entertain yourself? They didn't have television. They didn't even have radio yet. So what would they do? Well, they would go to see live plays, little skits, comedy. This was called vaudeville. This is something that if you had enough money, you could go and watch little live plays. You could go to the circus, which was pretty big around the turn of the century. Now, today, of course, circuses have fallen out of favor because people believe animals are mistreated, or they're just not something that people are really into as much. But back then, there weren't a lot of choices, so you might go to a circus. You could go see Houdini, who's right here in the middle. Harry Houdini was an escape artist who could dazzle the crowd by trying to escape from locks and chains, maybe even underwater. He was pretty famous. And, of course, he's killed when he is struck in the abdomen. One of his tricks was to have people punch him in the stomach, and he could handle it, but he wasn't ready for one punch, and it damaged him, and he died. Another new book that year was The Wizard of Oz in the year 1900. So this was a book that you might have seen in the movie, but it really was a great children's book that spoke to a lot of the things that were going on in society, though. OZ, Oz, represents gold, right? So gold is in ounces. OZ is the symbol for ounces. The yellow brick road is gold. And Emerald City is green, which is money. And so there's a connection there. This book was trying to convince people the connection between gold and the wealth. And, of course, every character has a symbol in the book. The scarecrow would be brainless farmers. Industrial America would be the heartless tin man. The cowardly lion is the government who's afraid to do anything about it. And, of course, Dorothy is the helpless American. And finally, we have the first movie that comes out without any sound, of course, called The Great Train Robbery. So things are changing. This is the form of entertainment you could have. And there was no music at the time, all right? So you would wait for sheet music to come out. I guess they dropped the sheet music, and you could go buy it and play it on your harpsichord. But around 1900, there were ways to be entertained, probably better than any time before, but compared to what we have today, not so great.